Mr. Toastmaster, fellow Toastmaster, the topic of my speech that I prepared for you today is to teach you guys how to speak publicly. I have a dream that one day every valley will be exalted and every mountain and hill will be made low. When Martin Luther King delivered that speech in 1963, he was looking at an audience of 250,000 people. But even that audience of 250,000 people pales in comparison to the speech that Pope John Paul II gave at World Youth Day in 1995. On that day in the Manila, Philippines, 5 million people came to see the Pope speak. That is the largest crowd size that we know that was recorded in the 20th century. How did these men do it? How did Martin Luther King and John Paul II learn how to speak publicly in front of such large crowds? In the first century, the Roman senator Seneca talked about public speaking in his era, the orators who loved to use their hands in the middle of the Roman Senate. He talked about how the General Pompey, one of the greatest Roman generals, would get red in the face, like an Italian tomato. Red in the face every time he spoke publicly. That was one of the greatest Roman generals of all time. Seneca talked about how people in the Roman Forum would have shaky knees or chattering teeth as they tried to speak publicly. Public speaking has been around for centuries, but fear of public speaking has been around equally longer. We know that fear of public speaking is not uncommon, and I'd like to tell you today how to overcome that fear. If I could go back in time and tell my young 10-year-old self something, it would be this. This matters. I didn't know at that time, at 10 years old, how many speeches I'd have to give, how many college interviews, how many times I'd have to speak to my colleagues. Even something as simple as ordering food at a restaurant. Public speaking has been used in my life over and over and over again. This matters. But how do we overcome that fear? The first step to overcome the fear of public speaking is to prepare well. When I was in high school in my senior year of the IB program, we were all given a book to analyze in class. When I analyzed that book, I wrote down every single bullet point I could think of. Every point that I wanted to come across, I wanted to write down. I arranged them in sequential order, and I made sure to present them well. But one of the things that I was most proud of is I was able to memorize that speech. You see, when you memorize a speech and when you're not reading off cards, is that you're free. And because I'm free, I don't rely on flashcards or a written essay or even a tablet or my phone. I'm free to use my hands. I'm free to engage you with eye contact. I'm free to walk around and pace around this room. Memorizing your speech is a great way to focus on presentation rather than content. But how do we present a speech? There are 3 P's that we learned in Toastmasters about presenting a speech: to pace, to pause, and to project. When it comes to pacing, you don't want to speak too quickly because people won't know what you're saying. You want to speak at a normal pace. Slow down if something's hard for your audience to understand, and speak normally if you want to go at a normal pace. Next, taking pauses. We feel the need to fill up space because we're uncomfortable with silence. But once you've memorized the speech, you can focus on the presentation of which points you want your audience to understand. When Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech, he repeated that phrase, I have a dream, 8 times. It's okay to repeat yourself. It's okay to take pauses when you want a point to get across to your audience. Lastly, with projection, you don't want to yell, but we want to speak at a confident and bold voice. We want everyone to hear us, even in the back, so that everyone can hear what we are saying, to communicate clearly, efficiently, and to enunciate clearly. The third point is going to your peers. I remember when I was in high school, I had a political debate between Democrats and Republicans, and I was assigned the Republican side. But after I'd written my speech, I went to my dad, and I realized as a young 9th grader, I didn't know what a Republican was. I couldn't tell you the difference between the Democrat and Republican platforms. Now, this was back in the 2000s when those types of debates were normal. But even as a young ninth grader, I didn't even know whether John F. Kennedy was a Democrat or Republican. That just shows how ignorant I was. And I'm thankful that I had the humility to go to my dad, who corrected me and set me straight. When you go to your peers, you can get great feedback. Feedback on your pacing, on your timing, on your speaking style. Never be afraid to get a second set of eyes on your speech. The next point I would make, and a point that I really want to stress, is prayer. Oftentimes, when I was in a dire need of stress, I was anxious, I would pray for comfort and peace. When I was in college and I was going across the country to go to medical school examinations and interviews, I would always have a rosary in my breast pocket because I always wanted to feel at peace. Never underestimate the value of prayer. With those 4 points, preparing your speech, practicing, going to your peers in prayer, I want to leave you with 2 more points. The first is this: be not afraid. That quote from St. John Paul II over and over and over again, be not afraid. I think one of the reasons why so many speeches are stifled and squashed is because we're afraid. We're afraid of other people's opinions. We're afraid of how other people might react. My challenge to you and my dare to you is this: be not afraid. Do not be afraid to be challenging. Do not be afraid to take the unpopular position. Do not be afraid to stand up for what you believe, no matter what anyone thinks. I dare you and I challenge you to be bold, to be daring, to be adventurous, most importantly, to be yourself. Do not fear anyone else's opinion, but what you should be afraid of is that you never express yourself. My final point is this: when I gave my first Toastmaster speech at the age of 10, I did not make first place. I didn't make the top third place. The top 3 winners were allowed to go on, and they were allowed to present their speech at the adult Toastmasters. I was not. And at that time, I may have felt dejected or disappointed, but that wasn't the end of my story. I kept growing. I honed my craft and I worked on it. Now today, am I able to speak in front of 5 million people as Pope John Paul II did? I'm not sure. But here's what I do know. In the 15 years since I gave my first Toastmaster speech, I have grown in every single way. And I encourage you and advise you to keep growing. Mr. Toastmaster, fellow Toastmaster, I am confident that if you follow the guidelines of my speech, you will deliver amazing speeches. All of you have amazing ideas in your head about society, politics, economic science, religion, and the world needs to hear your opinion communicated clearly and efficiently. I am confident if you follow my guidelines in this speech, you will deliver amazing speeches. And I cannot wait to hear them. Thank you. Wow.